The hill did not look like much from a distance. It rose slowly from the surrounding farmland, a long uneven slope broken by patches of exposed earth, loose stone, and scattered brush. To an untrained eye, it was just another feature of the countryside, another rise in a land already shaped by natural folds and shallow ridgelines. But for the men fighting in Italy in 1944, hills like this could decide everything. Because whoever held the high ground controlled the battlefield below. German forces understood that better than anyone. Their defensive lines across Italy had been built around terrain, not just fortifications. Machine guns were positioned to cover approaches, artillery registered every likely advance route, and tanks were held back to counterattack any breakthrough attempt. And when it came to terrain like this hill, they had already made a judgment. No tank would climb it. The slope was too steep in sections, the ground too loose under heavy weight, and the approach too exposed to enemy fire. Even experienced armored crews had learned to avoid such inclines. Tanks were not designed for that kind of ascent under combat conditions, not without risk of stalling, sliding, or simply becoming an immobile target halfway up. So the Germans built their defense accordingly. At the top of the hill, partially concealed behind stone outcroppings and reinforced earth positions, they placed machine guns and anti-tank weapons with clear views of the valley below. The road that wound around the base of the hill was already covered by fire, and any attempt to advance along it would be met with immediate resistance. Their tanks, primarily Panzer IVs positioned behind the ridge, remained in reserve, ready to engage anything that attempted to break through the lower approaches. It was a strong position, not because it was heavily fortified, but because it was built around a simple assumption. No tank would come straight up the hill. On the Allied side, British forces had been pushing steadily forward through the region, encountering exactly this kind of resistance at every turn. Progress was slow, measured in yards rather than miles. Every ridge had to be taken, every position cleared, often at significant cost. Infantry alone could not do it efficiently. Artillery could weaken positions but not always destroy them. What was needed was something that could move forward under fire and reach the top. That was where Churchill came in. When the first reports of Churchill tanks being brought forward reached the German line, the reaction was almost immediate. Laughter. Among German tank crews, Churchill did not command respect. Its shape was unusual, long, low, and heavy, with tracks that wrapped almost entirely around the hull. Compared to the more modern and balanced designs of German armor, it looked outdated. Slow. Overbuilt in some areas, underpowered in others. Some called it clumsy. Others called it obsolete. And among certain crews, the name stuck. A tank that looked like it belonged to another war. But appearances in war often concealed something more important. The Churchill had been designed with a very different purpose in mind. It was not built for speed. It was not built for long-range tank duels. It was built for terrain. Its long-track design allowed it to grip ground that would defeat other vehicles. Its weight distribution gave it stability on slopes that would stall or overturn lighter, faster tanks. And its engine, while not fast, delivered consistent torque that allowed it to keep moving under conditions where others might lose traction entirely. These were not qualities that impressed observers on flat ground. But they mattered in places like this hill. At the base of the slope, hidden partially behind a line of broken stone walls, a troop of Churchill tanks waited under low cover. Their engines idled quietly, the sound blending with the distant rumble of artillery echoing through the valleys. Inside one of the tanks, Sergeant William Carter adjusted his headset slightly, listening to the faint crackle of radio traffic as orders were passed down. He had seen the hill already. From a distance. Up close, it looked worse. The incline was steeper than it appeared from below, and the ground showed signs of previous movement, tracks from earlier attempts, likely from lighter vehicles or reconnaissance units that had tried and failed to push upward. The question was not whether it would be difficult. The question was whether it could be done at all. Over the radio, the troop commander's voice came through. Short. Direct. No road. Straight up. There was no hesitation in the order. The German defenses had been built to stop an approach along the expected route. That meant the unexpected route, the one they believed impossible, was now the only viable option. Carter rested his hand against the interior of the turret, feeling the vibration of the engine beneath him. Around him, the rest of the crew prepared in silence. The driver adjusted his position slightly, studying the slope ahead through the narrow viewing slit. The gunner checked the elevation on the main gun, knowing that once they began the climb, the angle would change everything. The loader secured the ammunition racks, ensuring nothing would shift as the tank tilted upward. Outside, the other Churchill tanks began to move into position, forming a loose line at the base of the hill. Above them, unseen but waiting, German defenders watched the valley. They expected movement along the road. They expected infantry probing the lower slopes. They expected another slow, cautious attempt to take the hill the conventional way. What they did not expect was what they were about to see. The engines of the Churchills rose in pitch. Tracks began to turn. And instead of moving toward the road, the British tanks drove straight toward the slope. The first few yards told them everything. As the lead Churchill reached the base of the slope, its tracks bit into the loose earth without hesitation. Dirt shifted under the weight, small stones sliding away from the pressure, but the tank did not stall. Instead, it leaned forward slightly, the long track assembly wrapping over the uneven ground as the engine pushed steadily, almost stubbornly, into the incline. Inside the hull, Sergeant Carter felt the angle immediately. The tank tilted upward, not sharply at first, but enough to force every man inside to adjust his posture. Equipment creaked softly as the weight shifted. The driver eased the throttle forward with controlled precision, resisting the instinct to push too hard. On a slope like this, power had to be applied carefully. Too much, too quickly, and the tracks could lose grip. Too little, and the tank might stall before gaining momentum. "Hold it steady," Carter said over the intercom. The driver nodded, eyes fixed on the narrow slit ahead, where the ground now seemed to rise into the sky. Behind them, the other Churchills followed. One after another, the tanks began the climb. Not in a rush, not with aggressive acceleration, but with a slow, relentless movement that looked almost unnatural against the steepness of the slope. From the German side of the hill, the first reaction came in confusion. At the crest, one of the German observers adjusted his binoculars, tracking movement in the valley below. At first, what he saw did not make sense. The shapes of British tanks were visible, but they were not moving along the road as expected. They were moving toward the slope, straight at it. For a moment, he simply watched, waiting for the inevitable. Tanks did not climb like that. They would stall, or slide, or turn away at the last moment. But they did not. The first Churchill continued upward, its tracks gripping the ground with a slow, grinding motion. Clods of earth broke loose and tumbled backward, but the tank held its line, pushing forward inch by inch. The observer lowered the binoculars slightly, then raised them again. Still climbing. "Panzer, Sie das?" he called out. Nearby, a German tank commander turned his attention toward the same point, lifting his own optics to the slope. He saw it clearly now. A British tank climbing. The reaction was immediate. Not alarm. Not yet. Something closer to disbelief. From their experience, tanks did not behave this way on terrain like that. Even German armor, well-designed and capable as it was, had limits. Slopes like this were avoided for a reason. And yet Churchill did not stop. Below, Carter's tank pushed higher. The incline grew steeper, forcing the engine to work harder. The sound inside the hull deepened into a steady mechanical strain, the vibration increasing as the tracks fought for traction against the loose soil and embedded rock. The driver adjusted again, keeping the power consistent. "Still good," he muttered. The tank crept forward. There was no speed now, only movement, measured in feet rather than meters. The nose of the Churchill lifted higher, reducing visibility even further. From the driver's position, the ground directly ahead disappeared almost entirely, replaced by a narrow strip of sky and the faint outline of the ridge above. Inside the turret, the gunner shifted slightly, compensating for the angle. "We won't get a clean shot until the top," he said. Carter understood. Until they crested the hill, the tank would be vulnerable in a different way, not to enemy fire but to the terrain itself. If they lost momentum, If the tracks slipped or the engine failed to hold the climb, they would become a stationary target. Behind them, one of the following Churchills hit a patch of looser ground. For a moment its tracks spun. Dirt sprayed backward. The tank shifted slightly to one side. Inside Carter's headset, a brief burst of radio chatter came through. Tight, controlled, but edged with tension. Then the spinning stopped. The driver corrected it. The tank regained traction and continued upward. That moment, small as it was, did not go unnoticed by the Germans. At the top of the hill, the tone began to change. The initial disbelief faded. In its place came something more serious. Recognition. These tanks were not turning away. They were not stalling. They were climbing. Panzer WWII, one of the German officers ordered sharply. Tank crews moved quickly now, climbing into their vehicles, engines roaring to life behind the ridge. The Panzer IVs that had been held in reserve were now being brought forward, but their positioning was wrong. They had been placed to cover the road, to engage targets approaching along predictable lines, not to face tanks coming directly up the slope. By the time the first German turret cleared the ridgeline, Carter's Churchill was already halfway up the hill. The angle inside the tank had grown severe. Loose items shifted despite being secured. The engine strained, but it did not falter. Every inch gained now carried weight, not just physically but tactically, because the higher they climbed, the less time the Germans had to react. Carter leaned slightly toward the periscope, trying to catch a glimpse of the crest. "Keep it moving," he said. The driver didn't answer. He didn't need to. The entire tank was focused on one thing: forward. Above them, German machine guns began to fire. The first bursts tore across the slope, kicking up dirt and rock as they tried to suppress the advancing tanks. But the angle worked against them. The Churchill's frontal armor, already thick, was now sloped even further by the incline, deflecting rounds that struck without effect. Still, the fire intensified. More weapons joined in. The hill that had been considered secure just minutes earlier was now under direct assault, from a direction no one had planned for. Carter's tank climbed higher, closer to the crest, closer to the point where the battle would shift from ascent to engagement. Behind him, the rest of the troop followed, slow, relentless, unstoppable. And at the top of the hill, the German crews began to understand something they had not considered before. The tank they had mocked, I was about to reach them. The final stretch of the climb felt longer than everything that had come before it. Inside the Churchill, the angle had become so steep that Carter had to brace himself against the turret frame just to stay balanced. The engine roared now with a deeper strain, every mechanical component working at its limit as the tracks clawed at the last section of loose earth and stone. The ground beneath them shifted constantly, small slides of dirt giving way under the tank's weight. But the long tracks continued to grip, pulling the vehicle upward with slow, deliberate force. "Almost there," the driver said, his voice tight but controlled. Carter leaned forward, peering through the periscope. For a moment all he could see was sky, a pale, washed-out gray stretching above the ridge. Then, gradually, the edge of the hill began to appear. A broken line of rock. A low wall. Movement. "Contact top," Carter said sharply. Above them, the German defenders were already repositioning. Machine gun crews shifted their weapons to new angles, trying to bring fire down onto the advancing tanks. Infantry moved between shallow trenches and rock cover, some crouching low as they tried to understand how the British armor had reached a position they had believed unreachable. But the most important movement came from behind the ridge. The German tanks were arriving. A Panzer IV rolled forward into partial view, its turret swinging toward the crest as the commander tried to align the gun with the slope below. The tank had not been positioned for this kind of engagement. It had to expose itself to get a firing angle, and in doing so, it revealed more of its profile than it would have in a prepared defensive stance. Carter saw it immediately. Tank! Front! Just over the crest. The gunner adjusted, but the angle was still wrong. "Can't get full elevation," he said. "Not yet." They needed a few more feet, a few more seconds. Churchill continued its climb. The front of the tank reached the lip of the hill, the tracks pulling the hull forward until the nose began to level slightly. The transition was abrupt, one moment angled steeply upward, the next shifting toward horizontal ground. That was the moment everything opened. The battlefield revealed itself in full. German infantry positions spread across the ridge. Machine gun nests hastily repositioned. And directly ahead, no more than 50 yards away, the Panzer IV. "On!" the gunner shouted. "Fire!" Churchill's main gun roared. The confined space of the turret amplified the blast, the recoil slamming through the tank as the shell left the barrel at high velocity. Outside, the round struck the Panzer's frontal armor just as the German gunner attempted to bring his own weapon to bear. The impact was immediate. A burst of sparks and flame erupted from the point of contact, followed by a sharp jolt that rocked the German tank backward. The Panzer's turret jerked slightly off alignment, the crew inside thrown off balance by the sudden strike. "Hit!" the loader called out instinctively, but Carter didn't wait. "Reload!" The loader moved quickly, pulling another shell into position as the breach opened and closed with practiced speed. Across the ridge, German infantry scattered for cover. The presence of Churchill at the top of the hill had changed everything in seconds. What had been a defensive advantage moments earlier had become a liability. The ridge no longer protected them, it exposed them. The Panzer tried to respond. His gun fired. The shell struck low against the Churchill's hull, the impact ringing through the armor with a heavy metallic force. Inside, the crew felt the shock, but the armor held. The angle of Churchill's position, combined with its thick plating, deflected much of the impact. "Still good," the driver shouted. "Again," Carter ordered. The gunner adjusted slightly. "On! Fire!" The second British round hit with devastating precision. This time the shell struck closer to the turret ring, penetrating the weaker point between hull and turret. The effect was immediate and violent. Smoke burst from the seams of the Panzer's turret, followed by a flicker of flame that quickly spread inside the vehicle. The German tank shuddered once, then stopped. The threat was neutralized. But there was no time to focus on a single victory. Behind Carter's Churchill, the second and third tanks of the troop were now reaching the crest. One by one, they emerged over the ridge, their long silhouettes rising into view in a way that must have seemed almost unreal to the German defenders. Tanks were not supposed to appear from that direction, not from that angle, not from that slope, but they were here, and now they were advancing. Machine guns opened fire again, but the effect was limited. The Churchills pushed forward across the ridge, their armor absorbing small arms fire as their own weapons began to dominate the position. One tank swung its hull slightly, bringing its machine gun to bear on a cluster of German infantry attempting to regroup behind a stone outcrop. Another adjusted position to cover a secondary approach where more enemy movement had been spotted. Carter's tank continued forward, now fully on level ground. "Keep pushing," he said. The driver advanced, the Churchill moving steadily across the ridgeline that had been considered untouchable just minutes earlier. Behind them, the valley stretched out, the path they had climbed now visible as a scar of disturbed earth and crushed stone. Ahead, the German line was breaking. What had begun as disbelief had turned into urgency, and now into retreat. The hill that no tank was supposed to climb had just been taken by the very machine they had mocked. And the battle was no longer being fought on their terms. The moment the second and third Churchills crested the ridge, the battle shifted from resistance to collapse. What had been a structured defensive position only minutes earlier now began to fragment under pressure from an unexpected direction. German infantry, trained to hold the ridge against an advance from below along the road, suddenly found themselves exposed to armored fire from the very ground they believed secure. Their machine guns, carefully positioned to cover the valley approaches, were now facing the wrong direction. Reorienting them took time they no longer had. Carter's Churchill pushed forward steadily, its tracks grinding over rock and loose soil as it advanced across the crest. The tank did not accelerate. It did not surge forward aggressively. It simply moved, slow, deliberate, and unstoppable, forcing everything in front of it to react or withdraw. To the left, One of the following Churchills fired its hull-mounted machine gun into a shallow trench where German soldiers had attempted to regroup. The burst was controlled but effective, driving the defenders back from their position. Another tank rotated slightly, bringing its main gun toward a secondary emplacement where an anti-tank weapon had just been identified. "Gun, right side low," came a voice over the radio. Carter turned immediately. He saw it. A concealed anti-tank position partially hidden behind broken stone and brush, the barrel just becoming visible as the crew inside scrambled to bring it into action. "Traverse right," he ordered. The turret moved. The gunner adjusted quickly, aligning the sight as the tank continued its slow forward movement. "On! Fire!" Churchill's gun thundered again. The shell struck the position before the German crew could fully react. The impact shattered the cover, sending fragments of stone and earth outward in a violent spray. The anti-tank weapon disappeared in the explosion, its threat eliminated in a single moment. Across the ridge, the German movement became increasingly disorganized. Some units attempted to hold, firing from behind rocks and shallow positions, but the coordinated defense was gone. Without the advantage of terrain and prepared angles, they were now facing armored vehicles at close range, something the ridge had been meant to prevent entirely. More importantly, their own tanks were now at a disadvantage. The remaining German armor, positioned behind the ridge, struggled to reposition effectively. The slope that had protected them from a frontal assault now worked against them. To engage the Churchills, they had to expose themselves, either by cresting the ridge or attempting to maneuver along narrow, uneven ground. One Panzer attempted exactly that. It moved along the rear slope, trying to gain a firing angle without fully exposing its hull. But the terrain that had seemed manageable from a defensive standpoint now revealed its limitations. The ground was uneven, broken, and restrictive, far less suited for maneuver than the valley below. Carter spotted the movement. "Tank, rear slope, moving left," he called. The gunner shifted again, tracking the partially visible silhouette as it attempted to reposition. "Got it. Fire when ready." The shot came quickly. The shell struck the Panzer side as it angled across the slope, hitting a weaker section of armor. The impact forced the tank to halt abruptly, smoke beginning to seep from the engine compartment as the crew inside lost control of the situation. The remaining German armor hesitated, and that hesitation was decisive, because by now more British forces were arriving. Infantry units, previously pinned below the ridge, had begun moving forward once the machine gun fire above had weakened. With the Churchills now holding the high ground, the path upward was no longer under direct suppression. What had been an impossible approach minutes earlier was now open. The German line, built around controlling that approach, had lost its anchor. Carter's tank continued advancing across the ridge, now moving past the positions that had once dominated the battlefield below. He could see the full layout of the defense now, how it had been designed, how each piece had supported the other, and how quickly it had unraveled. "Keep pushing forward," came the troop commander's voice over the radio. There was no need to hold the crest. The objective was to break through. The Churchill moved toward the far side of the ridge, its tracks crushing through shallow positions and scattered equipment left behind in the rapid withdrawal. Around them, the sounds of battle had shifted, from intense, concentrated fire to scattered engagements as German units disengaged and fell back. Some soldiers ran. Others moved in small groups, attempting to regroup farther down the slope. But the organized resistance was gone. The hill, once considered secure, had been taken, not through overwhelming force, not through prolonged bombardment, but by exploiting something the defenders had overlooked: terrain. Carter glanced briefly to his left, where another Churchill moved parallel to his own, its hull marked with dust and scratches from the climb. Beyond it, the valley stretched out, now fully visible from the height they had gained. He thought back to the base of the hill. At the moment the order had come through. No road. Straight up. At the time it had seemed like a risk. Now it was clear. It had been the only way. The tank beneath him continued forward, steady and unshaken, as if the climb had been nothing more than another movement across ground. Behind them, British infantry secured the ridge. Ahead, the path forward had opened. And somewhere along that line, the idea that Churchill was slow, outdated, or ineffective had just been proven wrong in the most direct way possible. Because the tank that had been mocked had gone exactly where it was needed, and in doing so had broken a position that should have held. By the time the ridge was fully secured, the battlefield had settled into a different kind of silence. Not the tense, waiting silence that had existed before the climb, but the quiet that follows when a position has been broken and there is nothing left to contest it. Smoke drifted slowly across the hilltop, rising from damaged equipment and scattered defensive works that had been abandoned in haste. The ground itself bore the marks of the engagement. Track imprints carved deep into the soil, shattered stone from destroyed positions, and the long scar running down the slope where the Churchills had forced their way upward. From the crest, the view stretched wide across the valley below. What had once been a controlled killing zone was now exposed from above, its defensive geometry reversed completely. The road that had been covered by machine gun fire lay open. The lower approaches, once considered too dangerous to cross, were now accessible under the protection of the high ground. British infantry moved steadily across the ridge, securing what remained of the German positions. Engineers followed, already assessing routes for supply and movement. The entire character of the battlefield had changed not gradually, but in the span of a single decisive action. Carter remained inside the Churchill for a moment longer than necessary, his hand resting lightly against the interior of the turret as the engine idled beneath him. The vibration felt steady, unchanged, as though the tank itself had simply done what it was built to do without regard for how unlikely it had seemed. "Hold position," came the order over the radio. He acknowledged it quietly, then shifted slightly to look through the periscope once more. The slope behind them, the one they had just climbed, looked steeper now from above. Tracks cut through the earth in a clear line, marking the path they had taken. In places, the ground appeared torn and unstable, sections where the soil had given way under the weight before the tracks had found grip again. It was not a smooth ascent. It was not clean or efficient, but it worked. That was all that mattered. Around the ridge, the remains of the German defense told their own story. Positions had been built carefully, using natural cover and reinforced structures to create overlapping fields of fire. Machine guns had been placed to dominate the valley. Anti-tank weapons had been oriented toward expected avenues of approach. Everything had been prepared based on a single assumption, that no tank would come straight up the hill. It had not been an unreasonable assumption. Most tanks would not have made that climb. Many would have stalled. Others might have lost traction or exposed themselves long enough to be destroyed before reaching the top. But the Churchill had been designed differently. Its long tracks, wrapping around the hull, had allowed it to maintain contact with uneven ground. Its weight, distributed across that extended track system, had given it stability where lighter vehicles might have slipped. Its engine, though not fast, had delivered consistent power, enough to keep the tank moving when stopping would have meant failure. These were not qualities that drew attention in open terrain. They were not the kind of features that impressed observers watching from a distance. And so the tank had been underestimated, mocked even. Compared to faster, more agile designs, it seemed slow. Compared to more modern silhouettes, it seemed outdated. But on this hill, none of those comparisons mattered, because the battlefield had not required speed. It had required traction. It did not require maneuverability. It required persistence. Carter finally shifted back from the periscope and signaled to the driver to cut the engine. The sudden quiet inside the tank felt almost unnatural after the constant mechanical vibration. For a moment, he simply sat there, listening to the distant sounds of movement outside, the voices of infantry, the clatter of equipment, the faint echo of vehicles being brought forward. Then he looked once more at the controls, at the interior that had carried them up the slope. There was nothing extraordinary about it. No advanced system. No complex mechanism that explained what had just happened. Just a design built for a specific purpose. And a crew that had trusted it enough to follow an order that others might have questioned. Outside, the ridge was now firmly in Allied hands. The German forces had withdrawn beyond the next line of terrain, forced to reorganize and reconsider positions that had once seemed secure. The hill, once a barrier, had become a pathway. Operations would continue. Other positions would need to be taken. The war would move forward as it always did. But moments like this, small in scale compared to the larger conflict, carried weight beyond their size. Because they changed expectations. They reshaped assumptions. And sometimes, they forced both sides to rethink what was possible. Carter climbed out of the tank, boots hitting the uneven ground of the ridge as he stepped into the open air. The morning light had strengthened now, casting long shadows across the battlefield and illuminating the full extent of what had been achieved. He looked back once more at the slope, at the path they had taken, and at the idea that had existed before the climb began. That the hill could not be taken that way. That no tank would attempt it. That it simply wasn't possible. War had a way of testing those ideas, and sometimes of breaking them completely. Churchill stood behind him, quiet now, its presence no longer overlooked. Not because it had changed, but because, for those who had seen it climb, it no longer needed to be explained.